All right, so we're here with Cole Perry. Cole Perry is a data analyst with a specialization in geographic data visualizations with Perry Strategies, based in Tennessee.
That's right, based in Memphis.
Right on. Thanks for coming on today. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm excited to talk about this.
Likewise. So, tell me a little bit about the types of data visualizations that you produce with Perry Strategies.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is local elections in Tennessee, and so some of the visualizations that I've done are basically showing people the types of districts they're running in, basically demographics from the census by tract, from the American Community Survey or from the decennial census. So talking about the population, median income, and certain pockets in these districts. So a lot of demographic analysis, shifts between one race and another, elections from candidates that previously ran in those districts, and so on. But a lot of them I do and I post publicly just for fun. So those are races that maybe we haven't worked on, but took an interest in. So statewide races in Tennessee or statewide races in other spots, and I know we'll get into it too. But I took an interest in some of this congressional data at large, and that's kind of how I started posting some of these ones that have effectively gone viral. So
Yeah, I so we've met each other a while back, but recently the reason I reached out to you most recently is because I had seen some of the news coverage around some of the visualizations that you had created for congressional district analysis. But before we
yeah.
get there, I just wanted to get a better understanding and have you tell everyone a little bit more about like what's the sort of expressed intent of the visualizations that you're providing. So what are your customers looking to learn, your clients looking to learn when when they're presented with the data that you have packaged up for them?
I think a visual analysis is one of the easiest things to understand. And it's also, you can tell the story that you really want to. I think you show someone a chart or you show someone a graph. Sometimes they don't get the full story, but I think everybody kind of understands the ins and outs of a map. And so, whether there's a scale to it or a count or something, everybody really understands location-based analysis when you're looking at it. They want to see a point in a neighborhood, somewhere they need to go, something that indicates something they need to do. Everybody sort of understands a map, and so one of the things that kind of drew me to what I've been doing more recently in some of the maps I posted publicly. I think everybody wants to understand a little bit more about sort of proxies they can view politics through. And so everybody goes to the store, everybody goes to restaurants, everybody does a location based activity. And I think drawing that connection to politics is what really interested me in doing some more of these maps.
I totally agree that, especially in the political, nonprofit, the advocacy space, I just cleaned out my office. In fact, that's
Yeah,
what delayed us recording this podcast. But in that process, I was pulling out, and I still have some of these maps from 2014, and these were up in our campaign office. And these are,
right.
you know, every political operative, for lack of a better term, that I know has some of those memorabilia. And we were using, magic markers to and putting writing physical numbers on precincts and or counties, however it was broken down. So maps very much are how we understand the playing field, as it were, right? And you can
Right.
dig into the numbers in spreadsheets, but being able to see it on a map that obviously was important to us. It was important enough to us at the time that we were willing to color like kindergartners onto a giant piece
Right.
of paper. Um, so I absolutely appreciate the value provided by that type of visual representation. It's one thing to see it on a spreadsheet, but be able to visualize it. So for us, the types of analysis that you provide, we would use, I would say, probably to time budget. Where
Yeah,
do we need to spend most of our time? Where do we need to spend most of our resources? How do we, where are those areas where we need to make up a particular margin? Where are those areas where we plan to overperform? Do we just need to stem the bleeding here and run up the score there?
yeah,
I mean, I could see that that those are the types of questions that your customers are asking when they sort of solicit a visualization from you.
exactly right. I mean, I think sometimes one of the easiest things is certainly when you have a spreadsheet and you can see there's a cluster of precincts where some of your donors live, or you kind of have to draw conclusions to reach that point, right? Like you can't, if you know that's where they are but they're not plotted out on a map and you have to search for where they are, you could just show somebody, hey, here's this precinct, here's this cluster of folks. This precinct performed much better for this race, year over year. That's way easier than kind of drawing, one conclusion to the other and leading people to what they might just think are random assumptions if they don't already understand what that spreadsheet's telling them. So I think the other aspect to it now, and this is something that's really become more prevalent in the last 5 to 10 years that I've kind of experimented with, is interactivity. Coloring on a map in 2014, it's super rudimentary. I think a lot of people who really understood where those boundaries were, that's one thing. But now we're reaching a point where even the type of visualizations that I provide, you can add a level of interactivity to them. You can send someone a map that allows them to click on a particular house or click on a particular precinct and open up a whole other different level of information. And so that's something that I think really brings mapping to the forefront of campaigning. People love having something on their phone, something that they can show somebody else, zoom all the way into their own neighborhood and view different points. And I think that that's adding a whole other level to campaigning that very few players 5 to 10 years ago were really doing.
Totally agree. I think that it's all about making the data accessible. With the
Yeah,
types of data that you work with, and obviously there's countless different resources of publicly available data, but it's the challenge is not just finding the right data, but also making sense of it. And so it sounds
right.
like that's the primary value that you're providing. So geography, obviously you have an interest in politics. I believe you study. What did you study? How did you get into this whole political mapping type activity?
Yeah, yeah. So, I actually went to undergrad for civil engineering, and I was the chair of the college Republicans while I was in undergrad. And so I had kind of spent a lot of time, perusing Twitter and finding people that were making these, and they were pretty, this is a while ago, and so they were pretty rudimentary. It seemed like a lot of people were doing them in Photoshop or copy and pasting and Microsoft Paint or something. And so I kind of just looked into it and found out that there were a wealth of open source mapping platforms with a lot of documentation about how to make these. There were a few different guides, a few different folks, you could find on Reddit or on Twitter that would release guides on how to make political maps, and I just kind of followed those. But after that, I went to graduate school for urban planning. And if you know anything about urban planning, very GIS heavy. And so took a lot of courses about how to use, the non-open source applications in GIS and how to use Python and R to produce maps by coding instead of just by kind of a click and drag program. So I took a real interest in that stuff when I was in that program. But I also studied. So I got 2 graduate degrees from Columbia, and the second one was in real estate development. And that program as well had a lot of different angles through which to use geographic tools. So some of those are, simple location based, drawing a circle around a particular location, talking about the demographics. You might use something like that for site selection, but all of those interests kind of combined, and you might not be selecting a site for a store, but you could select a site for an event, and you could use geographic
Hmm.
tools to do that. In politics, you could select a specific location that your donors might be, it might be easily accessible for your donors. Kind of just thought about using all of those potential tools in the political world, and it just kind of all fit together. So I really just gained an interest in this in undergrad and just kind of worked through it in grad school, and now kind of do it in my day job doing commercial real estate analysis, but also, working with my mom's company, Perry Strategies, and doing some of that location based analysis for her firm. So
Well, you already know that I really appreciate some of the sort of more fun visualizations that you've put together,
yeah,
and you took a crack at one of the sort of pet analyses of the sort of political punditry class, which is the things like Whole Foods districts versus Cracker Barrel districts.
right.
I'd love to talk about that, but if you could quickly give the high level overview of what does that even mean, and why have sort of political commentators, followers, and journalists, why have they looked at that as an analytical point?
Yeah, I think at its very basic level, people view the Cracker Barrel and Whole Foods sort of index as a proxy through which to view American politics. And what I mean by that is, I think people have a general idea of the type of customer base that might go to a Cracker Barrel versus one that might shop at Whole Foods, which is, obviously upscale grocery store. People joke about how much food costs. Now it's even owned by Amazon. Cracker Barrel, very simple, down home country store, probably located along a highway. They serve a selection of food that you know people on the road might want to eat. But what's really interesting about these two is that they have about the same number of locations, like around 600. And
Huh.
so they have a similarly sized portfolio, but they're not geographically, and they're geographically widespread across the country, right? So you have Whole Foods in a lot of different cities and a lot of different states, and you have the same with Cracker Barrel. And so I think where this kind of came about is the idea that two widespread chains that have similarly sized portfolios but vastly different customer bases, there's probably a political angle to where they locate. And so the idea, I think this that somebody actually did the analysis back in 2016 or 17 for the first time under the old congressional boundaries. And I just kind of looked around after the 22 elections and realized that nobody had done it for this cycle. Totally new maps, a lot of different new candidates, and I kind of wanted to see where the index, so to speak, would lie. So, kind of took an interest in tying together my two passions, right? And so, you take the political angle to this. I just simply wanted to know what this index looked like in the year 2023. But I also, for my own personal reasons, wanted to figure out how in the world to get all the Cracker Barrel and Whole Foods locations, just because I might be able to do some other analysis with them. And
Sure.
so, kind of just tied the two together,
Well,
and
what I
and
like
really
about
thought,
what you said, oh, sorry, please continue.
go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but one thing I really like about what you pointed out as it relates to Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel versus other types of analyses that you've done. So you've done things like which districts have a Dunkin' Donuts or which districts have a Waffle House, and while that or Publix, for example, and those are all regional, right? So
Right,
there's not too much that we can learn about the sort of Waffle House districts because
right,
they're all located in the South. and the number of Dunkin' Donuts districts or number of Dunkin' Donuts locations in a district obviously skews like very heavily, sort of
Right.
bright pink on the map in the Northeast, with some exposure across the country and particularly on the Eastern Seaboard. But wait, I was actually unaware that they had a similar size portfolio, but I guess that makes a lot of sense. And so, what have you learned about the differences between sort of a Cracker Barrel district versus a Whole Foods district? What why are we looking at those two, and what have you learned and through your own analyses? By the way, thank you for doing the 2022, because that
Yeah.
was something that we wanted to look at as well.
Sure. I kind of put on my urban planning hat to think about this a little bit, and that's that you frequent a grocery store, right? Whole Foods might be somewhere you visit once a week. It might be someplace that you even go to the bank or eat at a restaurant inside. You might go there more than once a week to go to a coffee shop. Grocery stores are really, in a lot of respects, for folks who say don't attend school or don't go to church, the grocery store is your other place. It's not work, it's not home, it's the place you do your shopping. Grocery stores are really the center of communities in a lot of places in the United States. And I think Whole Foods has really tried to take a real crack at that. Think about what a Cracker Barrel might mean, though, and why they're located where they're located. Certainly, they have loyal customers and people might go there pretty often, but typically, Cracker Barrels are places you would go when you're traveling to someplace else. You would be leaving
Sure.
your house and going to another city and eating at one along the way. So if you think about that, a Whole Foods might be located in a place where they have a solid customer base that will that like repeat customers essentially. Cracker Barrel probably doesn't have to think about that as much. They really look for something like a traffic count or, you
Hmm.
know, eh, people who might be traveling between two popular cities, but not necessarily being a destination in and of themselves. And so I think that's part of the calculation here is that I think Whole Foods really treats themselves as center points in some of these more dense neighborhoods, wealthier. They have their stipulations about the kind of demographics that they need, but a place like a Cracker Barrel, while they might focus on their immediate surroundings, probably has a much larger catchment area just because they're on the periphery of town, catching a lot of different people going between places. And so I think that that's, drawing this back to politics, you would find a Cracker Barrel pretty frequently in an exurb, a place where you would also find a lot of Republican voters. You would more frequently find a Whole Foods either sort of downtown in a ritzier neighborhood in a large city or in a wealthier suburb that has, a lot of easy access points to different neighborhoods. And so that's kind of one of the reasons people would really look at this as a proxy through which to view politics, because I think you can generally understand the constraints of building one in one place and one in another. You wouldn't put a Whole Foods in a rural area. You probably
Right.
also wouldn't put a Cracker Barrel in an urban area. And some of that's customer based, but some of those are also physical constraints about the types of things that they're doing. So I think that's one reason, or if not the main reason, that these kind of two establishments have in our minds kind of an aura around who might be attending one or the other.
So the way I think about the Whole Foods versus Cracker Barrel districts, looking at the representation, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, or I suppose there's a few independents as well, is the analysis tends to center around very similar to PVI. So if you're a Republican representing a Whole Foods district, or a Democrat representing a Cracker Barrel district, or a member that represents a district with both or neither. Those tend to carry some connotations. and in terms of what that means about the electorate, and how you communicate with them and how you approach your election. Were there any surprises that you found in doing this analysis? And I also have a question about, tie back to fundraising, but at a
Yeah.
high level, were there any major surprises that you encountered in doing these analysis for 2022?
I think the one that did surprise me a little bit when I did it, but probably wouldn't, with hindsight being 2020, is that the districts that have both a Whole Foods and a Cracker Barrel tend to represent the larger composition of the US House. So there's about 54% of districts with both of them are represented by Republicans, and 46% are
Hmm.
represented by Democrats. Expand that out to the whole House, and basically the number of districts is like 51-49, right? Because there's a slight edge for Republicans in the House majority. So that was something that I didn't really think about. But if you think about those types of districts, and I kind of piece through the list, what you realize is that they tended to skew towards pretty competitive races. If you looked at the types of districts that had both. And so for that selection of 40, 50, however many districts, for that to really represent the whole House was surprising to me in the moment, but in retrospect, thinking about it from the perspective of competitiveness really doesn't.
Yeah, makes a lot
And
of
so
sense.
I think that was really interesting to me. I think the other one was that, we just had redistricting, and there were a lot more Republican districts with a Whole Foods than I would have figured. And some of that is just by nature of Republicans clawing back some of that territory in wealthier suburbs from 2014, that they might have lost in 2016 or 18. So I was kind of surprised at that, but you think about this from even a fundraising perspective, and some of these districts that Republicans end up drawing in states are drawn pretty precariously. They end up sort of collecting a wealthy, whiter sliver of people in a city like Charlotte, or even my hometown in Memphis. And you think about that, and there's not really political reason to do that. They a lot of those particular spots are still pretty 50-50, or have become so in the Trump era. But you think about it and you realize that they collect a Whole Foods, or with those sort of slivers, and then fan out into larger, more rural Republican areas. And so I saw a lot of similarities with those districts. Around Charlotte, you could see this because it's very well populated exurbs. Around Atlanta, where you kind of get these districts that go deep into the city and kind of fan back out. I started to notice that across a lot of different, districts, particularly in states drawn by Republicans, and I thought that was really neat. North Carolina is probably not the best example, but you definitely see it in Georgia. Alabama is the one where this is the case too. These
Hmm.
districts kind of rope in wealthy whiter voters because that's where a decent donor base might be. Probably doesn't matter politically for the overall composition of those seats, but you tend to find something like a Whole Foods in those neighborhoods. That's definitely the case for my home district, Tennessee's 8th. You would also find this. I'm blanking on the particular district, but the one that wraps around Birmingham. A lot of southern cities, you would find this to be the case in. And I thought that was really interesting. So a lot more Republican Whole Foods districts than I would have anticipated in 2022. So those are a couple of things that surprised me.
So one quick analysis that we collaborated on, worked together, and thank you for your help with that, was
Yeah.
looking at the fundraising totals for congressional districts, and uh, we found that, very quick back of the napkin math, that the average fundraising total, in other words, the total amount of dollars, hard dollars raised, hard dollars being, campaign dollars, not PAX C4s and things of that nature, but proper donations to candidate committees, the sum total of all the candidates in the race in a Whole Foods district, those districts tended to raise more for their races, about $300,000 more on average for those races relative to the average congressional district.
Right.
And districts with both a Whole Foods and a Cracker Barrel uh, tended to raise almost $450,000 more for their race. And on the other side of that, there's the districts with only one Cracker Barrel, and they are raising significantly less, to the tune of nearly $700,000 less in a
Yeah.
Cracker Barrel district. And so with one Cracker Barrel, or at least one Cracker Barrel, no Whole Foods, those districts are raising much less. Now, sounds intuitive, right? If you're in a rural district, it's typically a cheaper media market, and you
Yep.
don't necessarily have to compete for for example, around here there's we're in between the Boston and Portland media market, so that can be expensive. And if you're in the tri-state area, that tends to be an expensive media market. Whereas if you're
Sure.
in a Whole Foods district in let's say, like you said, Alabama, it may not be as expensive to get your message out to your voters. Is there is there any other sort of fundraising or political trends that you noticed around the differences between those two types of districts, and what it takes to win in those types of races?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that we talked about when we were kind of going over this data was again the districts with both, and you kind of, if you want to lay back on the sort of perception of competitiveness in some of these districts, obviously a competitive race with maybe two strong candidates is going to raise a lot of money, and so a
Hmm.
district with both a Whole Foods and with a Cracker Barrel, those tended to raise more money than the others. I think because a lot of those skewed competitive. Even when you ended up removing some outliers from some of these other races, that tended to be the case. One thing I found really interesting was that districts with just a Whole Foods, not a Cracker Barrel, if you remove some of the outliers, it did in fact look like they raised almost exactly the median of a lot of these other districts. But if you dig
Hmm.
down into the numbers, what you'll find is that there are a lot of districts with just a Whole Foods where there wasn't a lot of money raised at all. And I think that's because you tend to see these days parts of the Whole Foods portfolio that are located downtown in an urban area where they might have a wealthy white customer base, but that district at large might be VRA protected and has a strong incumbent that has no need to raise a lot of money. And so a lot of these Democratic districts in, say, a place like Chicago, they might have a Whole Foods collected in a sliver of their district, but they don't need to raise a ton of money. They might need not
That's right.
even run a real campaign. And so I think that was really interesting to me. You look at it and you'll find districts where, there wasn't even a Republican in the race. Some of these incumbents have what would otherwise be kind of a strangely small war chest. And I think that you look at the individual ones, and that was really interesting to me. I think you might find the same thing, but from the opposite perspective in what we'll call a Cracker Barrel district. You might have a super strong Republican incumbent in a district that over the last 10 years has trended even more so Republican. That incumbent, like you said, probably lives in a cheap media market, if they even have a major media market in their district at all.
Right.
And so getting their message out to voters doesn't require a huge war chest, nor are they in a hugely competitive race. And so raising a couple $100,000 up to just a couple $1 million might send you out a couple of mailers, and you don't need to raise that much money. And so I was not
Does the
surprised
trick.
to see that. But you think about, adding that layer in, you might be an incumbent in a Democratic district with a Whole Foods urban area. It's a lot more expensive to get your message out to voters, depending on how you choose to do it. So you may need to raise a little bit more money, but you think about just to even, prevent a primary challenge or something. But it definitely wouldn't be that expensive, relatively speaking, in a rural district that would skew Republican. And so when you look at the individual districts, it really kind of puts some color to it. And one thing we haven't talked about, before I keep speaking in a long string here, is that districts with neither tended to raise a little bit more than the median district did. And you think about that, and it wasn't too different from the median. That's probably because, like, just like we were talking about these districts with a Whole Foods in an urban area, some of these urban districts that lack a Whole Foods, and then and a Cracker Barrel, and then some of these rural districts that lack both a Cracker Barrel and a Whole Foods as well, they have little to nothing in common other than they're probably well polarized into their respective camps. They probably even skew much poorer, and they have incumbents there that probably don't need to raise a ton of money. And so they might not have
Right.
anything in common except that from a fundraising perspective, they just don't need to do much. And so I thought that was really interesting. The districts with neither have very little in common if you look at the actual list, other than that.
Well, we sort of crudely call those districts axe murderer districts, meaning you could get elected to the office as long as you have the right, D or R next to your name, even if you were an axe
Exactly.
murderer.
Right.
So,
Yep. I think that's totally right.
well, I'm curious. I really appreciate you sharing those insights from your analyses and then looking at the data. I'm curious as to what else you might be looking at. What are some other geographic analyses that you are noodling around, or anything that you have of interest, or that you're working on or would like to work on in the future, if you had the opportunity to?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been looking at more recently, and since we talked about this the first time, since I posted the first one, I've done a couple of others. You know, in that time, I've gotten a hold of the McDonald's portfolio and Subway, and these are two chains. Subway has many thousands of locations, certainly one in every district, if you're thinking about it from a congressional perspective. So I've been looking at what kind of analysis I could do with a portfolio of stores or a chain that's much larger than some of the ones we already looked at. The other thing is I've looked at some of the, everybody's played around in DRA and talked, looked at the racial breakdown and the partisan breakdown of the different districts, drawing their own. But you don't get a ton of insights outside of your simple demographics and your, simple partisan RD breakdown. So something I've looked at pretty recently is maybe coming up with an easier way to, say, find median home value at a congressional district level or median income, something that you could draw a district on a map and analyze it underneath. I want to do a little bit more. The census is incredible. I think in 2021 alone, there were upwards of 25,000 different data points, and people
Wow.
really generally only think about four or five of them. And so that's a wealth of information that you could use in politics or in business that a lot of people don't do. And I just have an interest in maybe visualizing some of that stuff and connecting it back to some of the work that you or I've already been doing. And so I've been, sort of building my war chest of different tools in R and Python and JavaScript, and thinking about some of the different ways we can create geographic tools, to do demographic analysis on the level of a district, which I think is something that would be valuable to all kinds of use cases, specifically in politics.
Well, one thing that we had looked at very early on in our development at Trailmapper was a metric to sort of, I guess, replace or uh, supplement or to improve upon the what I think is a it's a quick and dirty metric. The PVI. PVI
Yeah.
is a nice heuristic to have, but it can be very misleading.
Yes.
And what we had looked at was, instead of looking at PVI from only two data points, which is the past two presidential elections, reality is that the president's performance is often a presidential candidate's performance, regardless of what party they're in, probably not as reflective of an individual, especially for challengers, individual candidates' opportunity. I'll say opportunity
Yeah.
because that it's really up to the campaign to make the pitch to voters. But we called it True Tilt, where we take into
Yeah.
account every candidate on the ballot in a particular geography down to the precinct level. So
Yep.
you have your president, your U.S. Senate, your congressional, state rep, state senate, and then anything below that tends to get almost too colloquial.
Right.
But
Right.
taking all of those into account, you get a much better representation as to the actual, if you want to call it PVI, the actual partisan lean, the true
Right.
tilt of the district. I wonder if that's something that you'd ever explore.
Yeah. I think I like using PVI, but it's because I'm somebody who's already in this world, right? I think a lot of people semantically misunderstand it and mix it up with a margin. You'll see people say, oh, this is a D plus something district, this is an R plus something district, and they'll kind of confuse that with, what PVI actually represents. I also think PVI has as one big glaring core flaw, and that's that it's built on the idea that assuming a totally neutral environment, one district could lean a one way or the other. And we haven't seen a Republican candidate win the popular vote since 2004. And so what that means is that you look at a district that might have a PVI being even, and in reality, that actually means that it skews Democratic because we've not seen a neutral environment
Hmm.
or or one that's close to it in a couple of cycles. And it does weight other races a little bit less heavily, but you'll see a severe drop in turnout in some of these midterm races. So kind of understanding how to weight that and how to understand what a true neutral environment might actually look like, I think gives people sort of the wrong idea. I think an even district after 2020, well, we just had two presidential cycles where the Democrat won by 2 to 4 points. And so an even PVI district is actually one that in the present environment would probably skew Democratic by that metric. I've liked the idea of using, a lot of different down ballot races to kind of come up with a new metric. And I'll give you a really simple reason. Tennessee only has one statewide race that's not at the federal level. And so that's governor.
Hmm.
And so you have to take a look at some of these smaller races to really understand where people lie, because the only other race that they vote in on the state basis would be one that has federal consequences. And so you have seen in a state like Tennessee a huge down ballot lag, around places like Memphis and Nashville, where Republican candidates on the state house level will do pretty well. And I think that sort of part of the equation needs to be included in sort of the PVI of those districts, because otherwise we're kind of presuming that all districts are destined to vote the way they do federally. And I think that's a silly way to think about it. Think about New
I
England, a
mean,
place with huge down ballot strength for Republicans. And we're doing them a disservice by just referring to their PVI at a federal level.
no, I think Well, I love everything you're saying because this is one of the challenges that I have been preoccupied with throughout
Yeah,
my political career, prior to starting this company too. Is you know, is it really a fair comparison to say, like, when you say that the district is an R+2? Well, that's that was one particular candidate that you are not. You don't have the same name ID as that
exactly.
candidate. We can't presume the same turnout. You don't have the same campaign infrastructure, you don't have the same message. So just because
Yeah.
that particular candidate, who is very different from you as a candidate, got a certain vote percentage, how much does that really matter to you? It's almost like you need to take a more holistic view. So I appreciate your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I
So,
think the other thing about it too, and this will be my last note on PVI, is that like, a perceived competitiveness does drive turnout. And so kind of
mhm.
misunderstanding some of these metrics does a disservice to folks who might just presume that a D+4 district, whatever that means, is a foregone conclusion for Democrats. If you were to really dig down into the data, I think you might find something else in some of these places that might change the result because there's better candidate quality or better ability to raise money. So I think that you guys are doing something that's really on the money.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. I appreciate all of your visualizations and all of the work that you're doing. It's really, really cool analysis, and I'm glad that we had the opportunity to have this conversation today. Looking forward to seeing what you got cooking up next.
Sounds good, and I'm glad we've kept up over the years and that we made this happen. So I'm excited to see what you're doing, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Cole.
Have
Be
a good
well
one.
now.